This is Anything for You. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 4. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 3. Chapter 5. Tuesday afternoon, McCoy made his first unscheduled visit to the farm. He stopped at the old farmhouse first, just because it seemed polite to let Fink and Ellie know that he was there. He didn't think they had much to do with the elephant. They certainly didn't have previous experience with it. He parked next to the porch and got out. He deliberately waited until school would be out, so Fink would be home. Fink and Ellie's 3 boys were playing in the yard. They called out a greeting and yelled, "Mom and Dad are in the house," as they chased each other around, a rangy-looking dog nipping and following at their heels. McCoy couldn't remember their names, but he yelled a thanks and took the porch 2 steps at a time. Fink opened the door just as McCoy lifted his hand to knock. "Come on in. You're just in time to join us for our afternoon snack. Ellie always has something good ready when we get home." McCoy opened the screen door and leaned against the door frame. "Thanks. It smells good, but I just wanted to stop in and let you know I need to make an inspection on the elephant." Fink's brows knitted. "Is there something wrong?" "Not really, but until she has a permit, I can't just let it slide. So she agreed to 2 inspections per week, 1 planned, 1 surprise. The planned ones will be on Saturdays. This is the surprise." "Oh, I see." Fink shrugged. "I didn't want to go down to the barn without telling you." "Of course not, but Jillian is really the one who's responsible for it." "I know." Ellie walked over, a dish towel in her hand. "She's at the dog kennel just finishing up a group lesson. She'd probably like to accompany you. The elephant seemed very nice, but it obviously knew Jillian." McCoy had hoped that Jillian would go. His experience with elephants was limited to Gator's wedding. If McCoy ever got married, which was unlikely to happen, he hoped that the most memorable thing at his wedding was not an elephant. "I have to agree with Ellie," Fink said, with a loving smile at his wife. "You better take Jillian along." "I'll stop at the kennel and see if she'll go. If it's okay, I'll leave my truck here." "Sure," Fink nodded. "You don't have to ask. If the inspection is your job, just do it. You can probably get Jillian's number to let her know when you're here, or whatever." "Does she stay here?" "She's got her stuff down at the little house where Harper lived before she moved to Chile." Fink nodded in the direction of what McCoy would call the mother-in-law bungalow. Oh, he'd thought she'd lived in the house with Fink and Ellie. It didn't matter. He wasn't going to her house. "Thanks. I appreciate your hospitality." Some people were downright ignorant to him, like he was inspecting their property just to make life hard for them. He appreciated the people who treated him like a fellow human just doing his job. "No problem," Fink said, his scholarly face smiling. "If Jillian can't go down with you and you want someone to go along, let me know. I don't mind being your backup." McCoy smiled and waved as he backed out of the door and let it close behind him. The dog kennel was down past the barn. McCoy had to walk past the tiny house that Jillian lived in. He gave it a few curious glances. What kind of woman worked in a circus, trained dogs, helped old men out, and kept an elephant on the side? If he was looking for eccentric, which he wasn't, Jillian definitely fit that bill. But he couldn't think about her like that. Yeah, there was a magnetism in her dancing, black eyes that pulled at something deep inside of him. However, not only was she trouble, but a woman like her would definitely agree with his former fiancée. McCoy was boring. He didn't need Jillian to say it for him to know it was true. The area around her house was tidy. A small rocking chair took up most of the room on the covered stoop. Lace curtains hung in all the windows. More curious than he wanted to admit to being, McCoy kept walking and didn't try to see in the windows. He had a feeling someone like Jillian might be messy. He didn't necessarily need things neat, but he liked order and schedules, something else that would probably clash with Jillian's personality. There were 6 or 8 cars parked along the backside of the kennel as he walked around the corner. 5 or 6 dogs ran in and out of their individual dog doors, barking and jumping. From the outside, the place looked clean, the dogs healthy. Carefully, he opened the door, not wanting to interrupt her class. But the door opened into an entryway. The next door had a big glass window, and he could see Jillian in the middle of the floor, her back to him, while 8 people with their dogs on leashes, sitting at their sides, faced Jillian, listening intently as she said something about homework for next week. After a sentence or two, she dismissed the class. McCoy didn't want to give the impression that the dog catcher had it out for Jillian. Might not be good for her business, so he leaned against the wall and tried to keep a pleasant look on his face as people filed out. Some of them knew him, others recognized his uniform, and everyone said hi at least. Jillian walked out with the last student, a Great Dane who pulled on his small female mistress. McCoy got the impression that the dog was the head of that relationship. Jillian was deep in conversation and didn't look his way.
He has to know you're in charge. But he's so strong, I'm really not in charge.
Jillian held her hand out for the leash. The woman gave it to her, and Jillian commanded the dog to sit. It obeyed instantly.
Now, when you start walking and he starts pulling, just pull this way, then that.
She demonstrated over the Dane's head.
You don't want to hurt him, although he's a big boy and he's strong. You don't want to choke him either, but you want him to learn that pulling you is not pleasant.
She handed the leash back.
You work on that some for next week. If you come a little early, I can work with you and Spencer before the other students get here. Oh, thanks. I'd appreciate that.
When the woman turned around again, McCoy recognized Christy Hammond. He'd been out at her place over a rabid skunk a year ago or so, but she was a lifelong resident of Love, same as him, and they were acquainted. Her dog pulled her toward him, stopping and jumping. McCoy had been around enough dogs to have had a split second to see what the dog had planned. He sidestepped, and the dog pawed air before crashing back down to its feet.
I'm sorry, Christy said. Good reflexes.
It's okay. Seems like this is a good place to bring him if he needs some manners.
He's a sweetheart, but he does need manners.
She tilted her head.
I bought a trap because I have some raccoons messing around in my shed. If I catch one, will you relocate it for me?
That wasn't necessarily on his list of job requirements, but he nodded. Sure, call me and I'll deal with it.
I don't want to hurt it.
I know. I'll set it free somewhere it'll be safe. From humans, anyway. Not that raccoons had that many wild predators.
Thanks, McCoy.
She lifted a foot and her dog dragged her out the door. McCoy's lip twitched, but he didn't laugh. Wouldn't have been nice. All the other students and their owners had left.
I suppose you're here to see Heidi.
That's right. He hooked his thumbs in his pockets. Jillian didn't look thrilled to see him. In fact, her mouth was flattened down tight, and she looked put out. Which irritated him some. He could have fined her on Saturday.
I'll go down with you. Just let me turn the lights out.
She didn't look at him, and her flashing black eyes seemed more subdued today. He had the feeling yesterday she'd been a little embarrassed that he caught her upside down with his uncle's dogs on her feet. But she wasn't exactly acting embarrassed. "You don't have to come. I can go myself." He'd brushed up on the law and knew what he was looking for.
"You'll make her nervous. She's never hurt anyone. She's sweet and gentle, but I don't know what she's been through lately."
Jillian flipped out the lights to the large open room and walked by him before he could open the outside door for her. Every move she made was accentuated with a flowing grace that fascinated him. Even her walk was somehow effortlessly elegant, sensuous. He stumbled over the doorframe. She looked back over her shoulder, a question on her face as she checked to see that he was okay. "I'm fine. Not used to the jam that sticks up like that." He might as well have said he wasn't used to walking in his boots. No, the problem was that he couldn't take his eyes off her to be bothered to watch where he was going. He needed to remember she wasn't interested in him that way, and it would be dangerous and dumb for him to allow his brain to keep going in that direction. "Did you find the papers the elephant traveled with?" he asked.
"1 minute."
She walked back inside, coming out in less than a minute with a large envelope. He took it from her hand and pulled the papers out. He'd done some checking since Saturday, and the papers in his hands seemed like they were correct. Jillian stood in front of him, twisting her hands. She stopped when he looked up after studying the papers. "These look good to me, although I should admit I've never seen elephant papers before." She lifted a slender shoulder.
"That's what I received."
"We'll call them good. Thanks." He put the papers back in the envelope and handed it to her. She disappeared back in the building and returned just as quickly as the last time. The lot was empty as they walked through it and around the building. The dogs in the kennels still barked and paced. McCoy didn't try to hide the fact that he was checking out the kennels, which were as clean as any kennels he'd ever inspected.
"Do they meet with your approval?"
Jillian asked, with a bit of defiance in her voice. "You obviously do a good job." McCoy turned to her and spoke sincerely. Her brows raised. She wasn't expecting his praise. Why would that be? The kennels were clean, and he wasn't afraid to say so.
"Thanks,"
she mumbled, her eyes going back in front of her. "You know I'm not out here to get you," he said, because he felt like that's exactly what she thought. She pulled her cheek in, chewing on it again. McCoy reached for the pack of gum he always kept in his pocket. He'd had a tobacco habit when he was younger, and the gum was a help when the rogue urge to light up hit him. He held it out. She glanced over, then her gaze shot up to his, her eyes wide. "Peace offering," he said, hoping for a smile. Her lips pressed together, one side twitching up. "Or maybe I'm just trying to rescue the inside of your cheek, which you seem intent on eating." Her teeth flashed and her black eyes sparkled. She tossed her head, but took a piece of his gum.
"No one has ever called me on it before, but you're right. I do have a tendency to chew on my cheek."
She shrugged. "We all have bad habits, I suppose." He'd never met anyone who didn't. Often a visit from him brought out the worst in people. Her face might have smiled, but her shoulders had not relaxed. She still held him in suspicion. He didn't feel like their relationship was easy enough for him to ask why. For some reason, he wanted that right. They reached the barn, and a rumbling sound greeted them.
"She hears us,"
Jillian murmured. "I didn't know elephants made a sound like that."
"They'll chirp, too."
His face must have shown his disbelief, because she glanced at it and said,
"Not like a bird. A little deeper and fuller, but still definitely a chirp."
"You've spent a lot of time with elephants." He'd gotten that impression on Saturday when she moved with such confidence and security around the large animal.
Yes.
And when I start asking about it, you become monosyllabic.
I'm a private person.
She didn't say, and you're prying, but she didn't need to. The accusation hung between them. Well, there were questions he'd need to ask for his job, and she'd have to answer those. But she couldn't be more clear that the extent of their relationship would be him in an official capacity. If only his eyes didn't want to devour her every movement. And if only he didn't have 100 questions on his tongue that had nothing to do with his job and everything to do with wanting to know more about her. She led him around the barn and into the barnyard, where he could see that she'd been reinforcing the old wooden fences with larger posts and beams. He had known that the half-rotted-looking fences wouldn't pass an inspection. You've been doing the fencing yourself? Posts, beams, and a spade, along with what looked like a solid steel digging bar that was older than he was and probably almost as heavy, lay against the stone barn foundation.
Yes. One of the requirements is that I have a solid, secure area to keep her. This is much bigger than the required 1,500 square feet, but I wanted her to be able to be outside in the sun if she chooses.
That was quite a job for one slender woman. Did you tell Fink and Ellie that you were doing this?
In general terms, they are both busy, Fink with his job and Ellie with the kids and planning on the farm for this year. I know they'd help, but I couldn't ask. They've already done so much for me.
Her voice got fainter and she looked away. I can't see in under the barn. I'm going to need to walk in. He was sure it was clean and that Heidi had feed and fresh water, but it was his job to check. He couldn't neglect it, although it was getting harder and harder to not want to treat Jillian like a job. Her determination to make that fence, one strong enough to stop an elephant, by herself, made him admire her and want to help. But that would be completely unethical, helping to build the fence he needed to inspect. It wasn't written in his contract that he couldn't help, exactly, but common sense dictated that it didn't make sense. When do you think you'll have the fence finished? He asked as she opened the gate and let him through. She shrugged and pushed a strand of hair back out of her face.
I've been working on it every chance I get around my clients and taking care of the dogs in the kennel.
Her hand started to fall back to her side. His brain didn't form the cohesive thought, but he reached out and grabbed her wrist, turning her palm up. She tried to pull it back, but his fingers tightened. Broken, bloody blisters marred the entire inside of her hand. His stomach cramped. It wasn't hard to imagine how badly they must be hurting her right now, nor the agony she'd be in when she started back to work on the fence. Just picking up that monstrosity of a digging iron would shoot pain clear to her shoulder. Her long, graceful fingers were red and inflamed. The soft skin that touched his hand was white and delicate. Some kind of strong emotion backed up in his chest. It came out in anger. "Don't you believe in gloves?" he growled.
I didn't have any.
She looked at him oddly, like she couldn't figure out why he'd be upset about her hands. His teeth ground together. "There's a hardware store in town, less than 2 miles away. They have a shelf full."
I wanted to get it done.
Her feet were planted in a defiant posture. "It would take 10 minutes to drive there and pick up a pair."
I can't drive.
McCoy froze. She didn't have a license? His brain started whirling over the possibilities. Maybe in the city a person could get away with no license, with all the public transportation available. But around here? There was no subway, no bus stops, A taxi would cost a day's pay, and Uber? He supposed that might be a possibility, but he doubted it. She pulled, harder this time, and he let her hand slip out of his, the softness and warmth gliding over his calluses like skates on ice. He dropped his hand and fisted it at his side. "You can't drive, or you don't have a car?"
"I don't have a car or a license."
Her words seemed to be pulled out of her, and she had started to walk away, telling him the discussion was over. He'd never met someone more stubborn or more determined to keep her secrets to herself. He supposed he couldn't expect her to trust him. Following her back, he squinted into the darkness as his eyes adjusted to the light. The elephant flapped her ears as Jillian murmured softly to her. The long gray trunk came out and tapped down Julian's hand as she held it out. Jillian walked closer and stroked the elephant's side. McCoy came near enough to see the water and feed were clean and full. There were several big piles of dung on the floor, but they were all shiny and new-looking. Jillian kept the place as clean as her kennels, and it was obvious she loved the elephant. Just as obvious was that the elephant loved her. McCoy couldn't blame it. Chapter 6. Jillian's hands burned like the digging iron was red hot, but she couldn't stop. McCoy had been very interested in the fence, and it was a requirement, permit or no permit. Her fake papers had fooled him, although the guilt that she felt as he said they were good enough almost choked her. Carlos had done a great job, and she would make sure to tell him so, but it didn't make her feel any better about deceiving McCoy. Yeah, he did seem like a person who played by the rules, but there was something very appealing about a man who lived by a moral code. She wished she were worthy of that kind of man, but in order to keep Heidi, she was afraid her lying had only begun. She lifted the digging iron up, trying to ignore the pain that burned up her arms and traveled down, clear into the small of her back. Her entire body hurt, but she needed to get this fence done. She slammed down with the digging iron into the hole she had. It was almost deep enough to set the post. "Let me." Shivers raced down her back at the sound of a familiar, deep voice. A big hand wrapped around the handle of the iron between her two. She stared at it before lifting her face and meeting those deep blue eyes. His expression was serious, and his body crowded hers. She let go and stepped back. "These aren't going to take the pain away." He held up a brand new pair of gloves. She blinked, part of her wanting to refuse, but after a few seconds, she took them. He reached into his pocket. "But this might make it bearable." A small tube of painkillers lay in his hand. Her eyes went from the tube to his face and back again. His lip was turned back, like he hated giving her the pills, but he probably knew she wasn't going to stop. She'd never thought of taking painkillers. They were for headaches, cramps, and maybe the flu. "Thanks," she said, taking the small vial. He pulled a bottle of water out of his pocket. He'd changed from his olive green work uniform into jeans and an old black t-shirt that clung to his back and rippled as he moved. The water was unopened. She took it and swallowed the pills with several large gulps. "Sit down and give them a few minutes to kick in." He jerked his head over to where Heidi stood in the corner, watching. "Back when I was a kid, I spent a few summers baling hay and fixing fences. Back before the factory farms put the family dairy farms out of business. I have a little experience anyway." He'd begun working before he'd finished talking, and she'd backed away to give him room. After a minute or so, he set the iron aside and used the spade, scooping the dirt he'd loosened and setting it aside. "I assume you have permission from Fink and Ellie to put this up," he said as he pushed the shovel in the hole. She tore her eyes away from the way his biceps flexed as he maneuvered the shovel.
"Yes, of course."
"Just didn't want them coming down here and getting all angry after seeing what we're doing."
"No, they won't. They've been better to me than I deserve. They both said whatever I needed to do to make the place so that Heidi could stay, I could."
And they'd offered to spot her the money, or she wouldn't have had the posts and bars she needed. "That's good. From what I looked into, you need a fence strong enough that she can lean into it without being able to push it down."
"Yes, that's what I found too. That's why I have the iron bars and big posts."
"You shouldn't have been handling that stuff by yourself."
"You have no right to tell me what to do."
She wanted to bite her tongue off. She didn't need to provoke him.
"I assume you're here in your civilian capacity."
"Yeah." He had taken the digging iron back in hand and it thudded into the ground, his shoulder muscles bunching. It occurred to her that this could be a conflict of interest to him. He didn't seem like the kind of guy that would allow conflicts of interest. She tore the tag off the gloves and gingerly put them on her hands. The pain had diminished to a dull thud, but they still hurt. Regardless, she walked over and grabbed the spade, ready to scoop the dirt and rocks out of the hole when McCoy quit pounding on it. She needed to have something to do other than stare at his back and the interesting way he filled out his jeans. But McCoy didn't allow her to use it. Rather, when he was done with the iron, he set it on the ground and leaned it toward her. "Trade me," he said.
"I'll do it,"
she argued, even though just lifting the shovel brought tears to her eyes. "Your hands can't take it."
"You're not wearing gloves."
He took the shovel, giving her no choice but to grab the digging iron or let it fall. "I'll show you my hands when we're finished. I started working with them when I was a kid, and they've developed such a thick set of calluses I could do this all day and they'd be fine."
"Mine will be fine too."
"I've had hands that looked like yours, blistered and bloody. Granted, it was years ago, but you don't forget pain like that." She couldn't deny they hurt. "It's gonna be days or even a week or more before you can use them without pain." He lifted a brow at her as he dumped more dirt on the pile that had doubled since he'd started. "I'm here. I can help. Let me."
"I don't put up with people who try to tell me what to do."
Again, her mouth got the best of her. Why couldn't she remember she needed this man to like her? But one side of his mouth quirked up. "I figured that out already."
"Didn't seem to change your words."
"Nope. I don't typically put up with people who don't listen to me. Guess we're both treading new ground." He dumped the last shovel full of dirt on the ground and leaned the handle to her. She took it, with a twinge in her hand and one near her heart at his solid jaw and the bit of humor in his eyes. "I've never helped a person become compliant so I could inspect them. Not real sure it's legal, but I couldn't let this go." His voice rumbled like the faraway thunder of an approaching storm, soft and low, but with potential power. She found herself attracted to the combination.
"Thank you,"
she said, because as stubborn and determined as she was, it was obvious that she would never have been able to continue working on the fence. "I think this hole's good." He looked around on the ground. "You have the next one planned out?" She picked up the tape measure.
"The bars are 8 feet long. I've been making sure the posts are spaced that far apart."
She measured from the middle of the hole he just finished to the next. They worked in silence for the next hour or so. In that time, McCoy was able to get the holes dug. The top of his shirt, front and back, was darker with sweat, and his forehead glistened, but he worked at a steady pace and seemed to be able to keep it up indefinitely. There. He shoved the spade shovel in the ground and rested his foot on it. Holes are dug.
I would never have been able to get that done. I really appreciate your help.
He nodded at the bottle of water that she'd left over when they'd started. You want any more of that? He asked. She walked over and picked it up, carrying it over and handing it to him.
No, you go ahead.
Thanks. He twisted the cap off and finished the bottle. Jillian stared at how his throat worked, how the cords of his neck stood out, how he stood, straight and true before her, tired and covered in sweat for no other reason than to help her. Why? He leaned the shovel against the stone wall of the barn foundation. Give me a minute. I have some bags of ready-mixed cement on the back of my truck. I'll back it down here and we can set those posts. Her eyes widened. He wasn't done? She glanced at the sky. They had maybe another hour of daylight. We can use my headlights if we need to, although if we put a hurry on, we might get it done without them. He screwed the cap back on the bottle. We'll need water to mix the cement. He handed her the bottle. Maybe you could fill this up too, if you don't mind.
Of course.
The least she could do was fill up his water bottle. He strode off, and she hurried around to get the hose out and screw it on, wincing at the pain in her hands. She took her gloves off to fill the bottle, and her blisters were oozing goo. Her hands had stiffened from the time of inactivity, and now it was painful to even try to bend her fingers. She couldn't imagine how it would feel without the pain meds. How soon until she could take more? She had just finished carefully pulling her gloves back on, the hose screwed onto the faucet and lying in a coil at her feet, when McCoy's pickup backed around the corner, the tailgate down and bags of ready-mixed cement lying on the back, with a wheelbarrow upside down over them. Hurrying over, she opened the gate to the barnyard so he could back through. She closed it carefully behind him. As far as she knew, Heidi hadn't tried to push against the rickety fence, or really hadn't even come out from under the barn much, seeming to prefer the security of having walls around her over the open space of the barnyard. As used to being in an enclosed space as Heidi was, that made sense that she'd need some time to get used to the new surroundings, especially without her sister and constant companion to comfort her. Still, Jillian didn't want to take that chance. She walked over to McCoy's truck as he shut the motor off and climbed out, her heart slamming against her chest. How was she going to pay for this? She'd used up every cent in her bank account to have the posts and bars delivered, and she owed Fink and Ellie for the material. She did have money in her business account from boarding fees and class fees, but she needed to buy dog food and pay Ellie and Fink rent. They weren't charging her, but she couldn't be a complete freeloader. Still, her personal salary that she'd budgeted for herself was completely spent until Friday.
Can I wait until Friday to write you a check for this?
She asked, not figuring there was any point at beating around the bush. We can talk about it later, he said, grabbing the handles of the wheelbarrow and lifting it off of the back of his truck. The ease with which he manhandled it threatened to derail her thoughts, but she tried to focus.
I've never priced out cement. I don't even have any idea of what it costs.
He stopped with his hand on the bag. You didn't ask me to help. I came here and pushed my way in. I'd hardly ask for money for doing that. Now, what I wouldn't mind is if you stopped giving me those suspicious glares like I'm about ready to rip your grandmother's purse off her shoulder and run off with it every time you see me. She put a hand on her hip, flinching a little from the pain.
Where I come from, government officials usually make decisions based on how much money a person has.
That's not the way it happens here. Not with me.
I've been figuring that out, but I can't just shove my experiences aside.
He dumped the opened bag of ready-mix concrete into the wheelbarrow, then looked up at her, gray dust coating his shirt and arms. Where are you from? What city? Did you report the crooked officials? She shook her head, panic bubbling in her stomach. He couldn't find out she wasn't a citizen. I know it sometimes takes justice a while to work, but don't let that keep you from coming forward. Do you have proof? Why had she said anything?
No proof.
His dark eyes narrowed, and he stared at her. If you work for the government, as I do, you're a servant of the people, and you should remember that, because the government represents the people. He used his fingers to do air quotes around government. She curled her toes, because it was too painful to move her hands, but she needed to fidget a little. Obviously, the man practiced what he preached. He was here, wasn't he? She'd been judging him too harshly. McCoy gave her another searching look, then shook his head. Before I put the water in this, I want to run a string to make sure we get these posts level. He went to the back door and rooted around, bringing back an orange string and a longish thing that Jillian thought might be a level. He put her to work holding the string, then the level, until he was satisfied. It's not going to be the straightest thing in the world, but it's going to look straight anyway.
It's going to be straighter than it would have been if I would have done it, since I wouldn't have gone to those lengths.
He grinned. Did the lady just say she was happy I was helping? Jillian knew her mouth was open, but it took her a few seconds to find her voice. Was the straight-laced government employee flirting with her?
Maybe.
Possibly he could tell from her tone how uncertain she was. The idea of flirting with him to try to get him to overlook her situation with Heidi, or at the very least her citizenship situation, had crossed her mind. But he hadn't struck her as the type of man who would break rules, even for his own family. That wasn't the only reason she hadn't tried, though, because it didn't sit right with her either. She didn't want to be that kind of person, even though she'd seen it work for others. She supposed she'd rather be deported than be a deceiver. He didn't say anything more, but turned and grabbed the hose, squirting water in the wheelbarrow on top of the dry, ready-mix cement.
Don't you have to measure that? She asked when he quit squirting.
His broad shoulder lifted. I guess you're supposed to. It's just kind of common sense, though. Jillian wasn't sure she saw the common sense aspect, but she didn't say anything. He showed her how to set the post, then had her hold it while he poured the cement around the base. It was full dark. McCoy had turned his truck around and they were using the headlights by the time they set the last post. If she had to, she could mix the cement by herself, using common sense to estimate the amount of water, which made her smile. It wasn't a skill she ever thought to have. What's so funny? McCoy asked as he wheeled the wheelbarrow back from rinsing it out.
Nothing really. We don't have a fence, but we're closer than we were.
McCoy glanced down the line of posts before lifting the wheelbarrow and putting it upside down on the back of his pickup. Yep. He slammed the tailgate shut. I'm not going to be home tomorrow night. If you can wait until Friday, I'll give you a hand with the metal rails. He was offering to come back? She could hardly believe it. Part of her wanted to jump on his offer. Another part warned her that he wasn't her friend, at least not when it came to the things she was hiding. Playing it safe was never something she did well.
Okay, I'll feed you Friday, so don't worry about food.
He leaned a shoulder against his pickup and crossed his arms over his chest. Not gonna turn down food.
I'll be here when you get here.
She could hardly believe she'd just made an appointment to see the dog catcher again.
I really appreciate your help. Thanks.
She gave him a smile. He blinked and didn't move. They stood behind the headlights, so she couldn't really read his expression. Maybe he didn't feel the little thrill that she did when their eyes met. One corner of his mouth kicked up and he pushed off his truck. See you Friday. She jerked her head and walked ahead to open the gate. Holding it while he pulled through, she waved as he left, unsure if he returned the gesture. She pushed the gate shut, leaning against it and sighing. Was she so pathetic that all it took to make her swoony over a guy was for him to lend a little muscle to her project? A scream balled in her throat when she felt something touching her neck. Then she remembered Heidi.
Hey, honey.
She stroked the long, rough trunk.
Were you being shy tonight?
The trunk touched through her hair, lifting it, then blowing. She laughed, still thinking about McCoy and why he might have helped her. Just to be nice? Maybe because she'd been checking on his uncle and training his dogs. She turned to Heidi, pulling her phone out of her pocket to use the flashlight app. For the first time, she noticed that Heidi's ears were droopy and her head hung down some.
What's the matter?
She asked, like the elephant could tell her. If she had to guess, she'd say that Heidi was missing her sister. She hadn't been able to get a hold of David, her cousin who owned the zoo in Mexico, and she'd have to give him another call when she got in. First, she needed to feed and water her elephant. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great Jessie Gussman audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.